Hello, everyone. I pray that you are having a glorious evening. And thank you, as always, for giving me a few moments of your time. And I desire to be a good steward of it. So let's jump into it. This is the second effort on my part to go back and get some of the meat that we left on the bone Sunday as it relates to the big payback sermon that I had the honor and privilege of sharing. Yesterday, we talked about Nebuchadnezzar and the call that was upon his life, and subsequently the dimensions of that call from God's perspective, and the application of that for us very practically. Today, what I like to do is go back and look at the city. Now, we talked a little bit about the city in the sermon on Sunday, but let's go back to it now. You remember me saying that Nebuchadnezzar spent 13 years trying to conquer this city. Now, it says a lot about the city itself that it was able to withstand or a 13-year siege in order and survive it, especially given the strategy and strength of Nebuchadnezzar. And the text says something very descriptive. It says that the soldiers had become bald and their shoulders were bare. As a matter of fact, let's go back and read it. Ezekiel chapter 29, verses 17 to 21. Verse 17, in the 27th year of the first month, of the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made his army labor hard against Tyre. Every head was made bald, and every shoulder was rubbed bare. Yet neither he nor his army got anything from Tyre to pay for the labor they had performed against her. And God goes on to tell him that he's going to give him the treasures of Egypt, the wealth of Egypt, and to pay for it. Now, it says in this scripture that every head was bowed. That means that the helmets that they wore for those 13 years had rubbed the hair from their head, and the shoulders were bare, if you would, because they had been carrying all these weapons of war, and their shoulders was bare from all that they carry. You got to realize this is not modern military. This is ancient military, and so they had put a siege upon Tyre for 13 years, and that 13 years, the soldiers' hair had the head had become bald from the helmets they had worn, and their shoulders was bare from the labor. Now, again, that says a lot about Tyre. The first thing we need to recognize is that Tyre didn't have their own army. They hired that. They had the kind of money, the kind of wealth that they could hire people to fight for them. And because so many people wanted to be in their favor, they would do anything to garner the favor of Tyre. So they had no slack, if you would, of people wanting to help them. So this siege lasted 13 years. Now, I want to just get into some practical things before I get into the spiritual implication of this as it goes forward. The first thing we realize that one of the reasons God had spent relatively 3 chapters dealing with Tyre was because of the disposition of Tyre. First of all, there was pride and arrogance. The city had become so prideful and so arrogant because of its wealth. As a matter of fact, the God addresses the prince of Tyre, and who is a man. And he says the leaders of Tyre, especially the prince, were extremely proud and considered themselves God. We find that in Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 2. The prince considered himself a god. Now, he had so much money and so much prominence that he became a demigod. He had a god complex, and that's going to be very important as we get into the king of Tyre. But not only did they have this pride and arrogance, but they also had the greed because of the materialism. We find that Tyre's wealth from trade led to corruption and moral decay. In many instances, even we see the hint of that in America. We become so materialistically driven and so greedy that we become morally corrupt. And so we end up electing leaders that resemble our greed and our materialism. I don't want to spend too much time for that, but you get the picture. You find that in Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 5, where God points out the greed and materialism. The third thing that we need to know about the city is that there was a rejoicing in the misfortune of others, especially when it came to Jerusalem. Now, Tyre considered Jerusalem as a competitive city. And so with Jerusalem falling, they began to see an opportunity to gain more wealth. And Ezekiel chapter 26, verse 2 alludes to that. And so they celebrated the downfall, the misfortune of Jerusalem. And I tried to apply this because as believers, we can never get to a place where we look upon people's misfortune as an opportunity to celebrate. I wished I had some help here today. And in many instances, especially in this political climate in which we live in, we got so used to putting people in categories, Democrat, Republican, liberal, or hyper-conservative, all these taglines that we put on people. So we begin to celebrate when one falls. And God prohibits us from doing that. He says that Tyre, particularly as it became Jerusalem, no matter what he did Jerusalem, Jerusalem was his, and he was not pleased with Tyre celebrating Jerusalem's fall. Not only that, we see that the idolatry became a part of the fabric of Tyre. Tyre engaged in idol worship, which was against God's commands. In Ezekiel 28, verse 18, we see that. So they became a very idolatrous city. Their wealth, their idea, especially with the leadership believing that they were God, and it only lends itself that they became idolatrous in their practice. The next thing, they was very deceptive and dishonest in their trade practices. They gained wealth by deceptive measures and dishonest measures. And even though the prince of Tyre had the wisdom that was beyond Daniel, according to scripture, he and leaders and tradesmen and business people, rather than excelling with the wisdom that they had been given, they chose deceptive and dishonest manners and methods in order to enlarge their coffers. And as a result of that, Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 16, God alludes to that. So the next thing we need to understand about Tyre is that the violence and the bloodshed that was a part of the city. Tyre's pursuit of wealth involved violence and exportation of people, and then the blasphemy of the leaders there claiming divinity, as we saw in the prince there. So let's just go back over and see what we find about this city so that we understand why God was fed up with it. And he spent 3 chapters out of the 11 cities, if you would, nations that God articulates and pronounces judgment upon. Tyre has 3 chapters given to it because of his pride and his arrogance, his greed and materialism, his rejoicing over the misfortune of others, particularly Jerusalem, the idolatrous disposition that they had, deceptive and dishonest trade practices and violence and bloodshed that was a part of the exportation of others for their own wealth, and the blasphemy that was a part of the city. Now, what is it that we are to conclude from this? Let me put it in this manner. America has boast about its wealth and making America great again, and all those are things that we allude to when it comes to the pride that we have for this country. And I think that we ought to be thankful to God for many things that America represents. But anytime we begin to create an atmosphere where we are blasphemous, where our wealth, it leads us to violence and bloodshed against others, or idolatry and as a part of the fabric and deceptive and dishonest means to gain wealth. It becomes a part of our disposition, greed and materialism and rejoicing over the misfortune of others, and ultimately the pride and arrogance that we have. God is saying the clock is ticking. And God is calling the church to say to the world, let's get right, church, and go home. May God bless you.